Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Rossum. I'm a really old-time synthesizer designer. I've been doing it for 48 years. I think that by some measures, I'm the guy who's alive that has been doing it for the longest. So I can hold that along with my gray hair. My exposure to synthesizers began at Caltech, where I was an undergraduate in the spring of 1970. My student house was called Dabney House, and there was this crazy guy named Bob Bland. And he got this crazy idea. He wanted to learn to play the music synthesizer. Now this was in 1970, and music synthesizers just weren't around at all. So he had to figure out where to get a music synthesizer. And he figured it out. He had two friends, Steve Gabriel and Jim Ketchum, both of them undergrads at Caltech. They were both double E majors, and he recruited them to try and build him a synthesizer. In the meantime, I was a senior. I was studying molecular biology, but I had the very radical idea at the time of applying computers to biology. That's now how biology works, but in those days that was considered a wild idea. And the idea of building a synthesizer sort of piqued my interest. So I knew about the project. I contributed what I could with my very modest knowledge of electronics. I'd taken some computer courses at Caltech, but really no analog design at all. Now the story moves to fall of 1970. I went up to UC Santa Cruz, and that's where Rossum Electro is now, is in Santa Cruz. I found my home there and stayed there ever since. My thesis advisor was a brilliant man named Harry Noller. He recently got one of the Genius Prizes for discovering, this is biochemical talk, the molecular structure of the ribosome, which is a thing inside all your cells. Anyway, Harry is also a musician, and one day when I came into the lab, I found a little note on my desk, and it said, "Dave, I'm over in the College 5 music department helping them unpack their brand new Moog synthesizer. Come on over if you want." So I met the Moog for the first time, and it was sort of like God taking you by the nose and going, "Over here, Dave." By that night, I was teaching the music students how to play the synthesizer, even though I'd never seen a real synthesizer before in my life. And of course, back then, Bob Moog didn't have any service department, so he sent out schematics with the synthesizer, and I started poring over these, trying to figure out how this thing worked. And I dragged my friends up from Caltech, and we poked around at it and decided, gee, maybe we can build one of these things. So beginning around Christmas vacation in 1970, I started helping these guys design synthesizers and learn analog electronics. And our first synthesizer we called the Black Mariah. It had a Tolex case, a little bigger than this. It actually had matrix switches in it. And it was horrible. I mean, just awful. It was out of tune, it would drift, and it just, it made raspy, awful, nasty noises. So we did what should be done with all synthesizers of that type. We found a window and we threw it out of it. We did take the very expensive matrix switches out of it before we did that. We never used them again. They crossed horribly, and that was part of the awful sound. But we learned a lot from building our first synthesizer. So over the summer of 1971, I recruited some friends from UC Santa Cruz. My girlfriend at the time, Paula Butler, Mark Panziger, who roomed across from me when I was in the dorm at Santa Cruz, and a guy named Mark Nilsson, who has since disappeared, so I don't even have a picture of him. And the three of them, plus Jim Ketchum and Steve Gabriel, now Bob Bland has disappeared from the picture too, the six of us got together and built the first real synthesizer that I ever built. It was called the EMU 25. It was semi-modular in that it had individual modules, individual oscillators, low-pass and high-pass filters, and VCAs, ring modulator, things like that. Played off of a keyboard, actually played fairly well in tune. It wasn't bad at all for a first synthesizer. And that was our product at the end of the summer. At the end of the summer, the guys from Caltech, they still had the degree to get, so they took off, and they actually took the Mark I EMU 25 with them, and that synthesizer is probably still somewhere here in the LA basin. We have traced it a little bit beyond, but and it's probably worth a lot of money if anybody can find it from the historic books. At the end of that summer, a high school friend of mine, Scott Wedge, showed up driving his Chevrolet, which, honest to God, the license plate was ARP 999, the last ARP in California. And Scott, caught the synthesizer bug pretty much as bad as I did. And so we, along with Paula, she stuck with us, formed EMU Systems and built the EMU modular system over the next year, year and a half. And this was a real quality synthesizer. Many people have called it the best modular synthesizer, at least at that time. And so I can tell you a little bit about it, but first, the history of starting a company back then. We sold our catalog for $5. We had a little ad in Popular Electronics, and people, there was a transition. When kids grew up in my age, they all were interested in ham radio, but it turned out in the late 60s, early 70s, there was this interest in synthesizers, and the kids just wanted to know about it and would send in $5 of their allowance to buy a catalog, and that was mostly how we kept the doors open for the first year and a half, something like that. We did make little circuits that they call submodules that we could sell for $50, $70, $100 that were more affordable than the synthesizer. But we didn't sell any big synthesizers for quite a while until we got a letter from this man here, Robert Moog. Bob sent us $5, and we'll check Bob Moog, and we sent it back to him. Said, your money's not good here. We owe you our careers. We hope you don't feel ripped off by us, but we think synthesizers are really cool, and we thank you for that. And he wrote us back this wonderful fatherly letter. He said, you guys are doing a great job. I'm really impressed with what you're doing. But you know nothing about business, and trust me, because I know enough about business to have gone out of business 4 times. So take my advice, you will go out of business if you keep your prices the same. Nobody takes you seriously, and you can't possibly produce these things for the prices you're quoting. Raise your prices, triple them. So sure enough, the next day, we literally overnight tripled our prices, and people started taking us seriously. I was becoming a decent analog designer. My first circuit invention is shown in this original schematic here. That's the ladder filter that Bob Moog invented, and we shamelessly copied that part of it for the EMU modular. This output stage, however, was something I actually invented, and we'll hear more about that a little later in the evening. And I love this quote that I found out of on the internet that talked about somebody who had an EMU modular. I guess you could say Moog had balls, but EMU had class. The modules were very well built. They had, I'd seen what happened to the Moog Model 12 that was at UC Santa Cruz within about a year and a half. It just looked awful. The front panels were built, the knobs were broken. It just got destroyed by the students. And so I determined that the EMU modular would not be subject to that kind of degradation. So no plastic knobs, all the knobs were solid aluminum. The pots and switches were designed so the pots you could literally take a mallet to the front of them, which somebody had done with the synthesizer at Santa Cruz, and tap on them, and then they wouldn't fall apart. Gold connectors, sealed circuitry, things like that. It was very well built, and there are a number of them still. Matter of fact, there's one at the University of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago is an EMU module that has been in continuous service through today. So that's pretty cool. Two of our early artists, Herbie Hancock and Patrick Gleason. Patrick Gleason is a synthesizer artist up in San Francisco, and he did an album of Holst's The Planets. And for those of you who play synthesizers today, let's see if I can play this. This was what was considered the thing you did with synthesizers back then. You imitated other instruments, because then you could play them off the keyboard, which we really couldn't do in any other way. Because I'd studied computers, digital logic came to me very easily. So the EMU modular had digital circuitry from the beginning, no digital signal processing, but the keyboard itself was entirely digital apart from this D to A converter. This is a prototype that was made back in 1972, I guess. And that enabled us to synthesizers at the time only played one note, and everybody wanted to play polyphonically. So the digital logic experience that I had allowed me to come up with the first really practical polyphonic keyboard and synthesizer. And the first album that came out was Will o' the Wisp. And if I play this one right here, this is the first polyphonic synthesizer riff ever on a public recording. I want to tell this story is because modulars came and then they went, and I want to actually answer the questions of where they went, and also many people ask what happened to EMU Systems, how come it's now Rossum Electro-Music and a completely different company. So one thing that is part of the evolution is we took that polyphonic keyboard, which was built with little chips and wires and things like that, and when the microprocessor was invented, EMU was actually the first electronic music company to build anything out of a microprocessor, and that was our 16-voice polyphonic keyboard that also had, because there's a microprocessor in there, all kinds of memory, a sequencer in it, so you could play and multi-track with yourself while playing it. It was a really pretty amazing piece of work for the time, and we sold quite a few of these along with very big synthesizers in the late 1970s. The other thing that happened started with this fellow. His name is Ron Dow. He's no longer with us. Ron came into EMU, I think about 1975, with the idea for putting a VCA, which was a circuit board about that big in the EMU modular, onto a single chip, actually putting two of them onto a single chip. And it sounded like a great idea, and he wanted us to give him about $3,000, which was a lot of money in 1975 to do that. But the problem was that the power supplies on the chip that he was working on were not compatible with the EMU modular. So we had to say, sorry that, because of that, we can't invest in that. The next guy that came to our door was this guy, Doug Curtis. He just won a contest on that same chip platform and had designed a chip that was a wonderful building block for synthesizers. But once again, we couldn't work with him because we couldn't use the chip because the power supplies wouldn't work on our system. But eventually, new chips came out that had compatible power supplies, and I ended up teaming up with Ron Dow and designing the SSM family of integrated circuits. I also remain friends with Doug Curtis, and even though as his wife, sometimes she laughingly said the other day when we were talking that, gee, we used to think of you guys the arch enemies, and now, we're all on the same side of this. So that was kind of cool. But the consequence of doing these chips was that now you could squeeze a whole synthesizer on a reasonable area of circuit board. And the next step, of course, begins with this fellow, Dave Smith. Dave Smith lived in San Jose, where we were in Santa Clara at that time. And he used to come over and chat with us about products, and he was building sequencers, and he needed help for what analog or circuitry was in there, so we'd help him either by selling him these sub-modules or just designing circuits and so on. We were good friends, and he was talking about, what am I going to do next now that I've got all the sequencers that I think I can build? And Scott Wedge came up, we ought to build a polyphonic minimo. We've got the microprocessor keyboard, and you know how to program a microprocessor, so you can do the rest of that stuff. And we've got our chips, and we'll help you with the analog design. And of course, the Prophet 5 was born. Now, EMU, the reason we told Dave Smith to do that project is our idea was much bigger. We wanted to build a not only polyphonic, but polytimbral synthesizer. It was called the Oddity. It would have 16 voices, and that's the front panel of the patch on that thing right now. It's a fairly complex patch. We actually produced an ad for it and introduced it at the 1980 AES show. This is Ed and Marco practicing in the hotel room for our demonstration. And it was well received, but when we got back, we got a surprise that Dave Smith and his partner Bob Parrish had gotten together with Doug Curtis and redesigned the Prophet and said, our business plan, by the way, was to sell this expensive Oddity synthesizer. It would take a long time to sell because it was so expensive. You'd have to promote it to people in studios and then wait to make a sale. We needed income to wine and dine people, and the royalties we were getting off the Prophet 5 was going to pay for that. The surprise was, Sequential said, we're not going to pay royalties anymore now that we've done this redesign. So we went from needing to, or being able to have money coming in to do the Oddity project to needing money coming in very quickly. So we paid lawyers to argue about this. I mean, ultimately it's all settled, and Dave and I are the best of friends these days, but there was some rough times in between. But necessity became the mother of invention, but also the death of the modular. At that same AES convention, there was the Fairlight computer synthesizer. It had 6 voices. They were 8-bit fidelity. and the darn thing cost $40,000. And we figured that's an opportunity to innovate, and the result, as many of you know, is the emulator, the first really practical sampling synthesizer. And at that point, EMU, didn't look back. We ran forward digitally, and it was probably a good thing, because even though in 1981 the modular was still in our catalog and you could buy them, by about 1982 we weren't getting any orders or any interest at all. It was really within a couple of years after that that we sold all the inventory to somebody else, and for a while they were absolutely dirt cheap. No longer the case. I think I heard of an EMU modular selling for $90,000 recently. So that was a very big one. And of course that's because of digital signal processing. That's really what killed the modular and the trend to go towards polyphonic keyboards rather than modular stuff. I love this ad because when it came out, I said, no, they got it wrong. The real truth is, digital is cheaper. The thing that killed all of that really was what we call Moore's Law. Moore's Law allows you to get digital circuitry smaller and smaller and smaller, having the effective price of what you want to do every 18 months or so. And with that kind of a trend, nothing can argue with that. And analog electronics does not follow that trend at all. It has gotten better over the years, but nowhere near. So I won't continue with the story of all the digital things EMU did and so on, but I would like to say a couple of words about what happened to EMU. EMU was acquired in 1993 by Creative Labs, and that was something we actually set out to do. We decided we wanted parentage, and while many people think that when EMU was acquired by Creative, that was the beginning of the end for EMU, it really was not the case. Creative told us, we're going to keep EMU as a functioning business entity. You guys can do what you want. We'll just smooth out the financial ups and downs. And they were very true to their word. For 10 years, from 1993 to 2003, they did exactly that. We brought out a lot of products. They may not have been as innovative as before, and I think that we can blame on the fact that we were no longer starving and terrified of going out of business. We could relax and see our families once in a while and so on and so forth. So I really have to myself take some personal responsibility in the demise of EMU, which happened in the next decade. What happened there, EMU was selling lots and lots of keyboards and modules and things like that, did fairly well in that market. But Moore's Law made those computers, this general purpose computer, get better and better to the point where the computer now became the competitor of all of those other keyboards and so on and so forth. And to be honest, while I absolutely love designing musical instruments, there's something very emotional about the hardware part of it for me. And when it becomes an instrument that you have to relate to by a mouse and a screen, it just doesn't excite me to do that. So, I mean, people have actually come to me with Rossum Electro stuff and said, will you write plugins first? I don't want to write plugins, I want to invent new modules and so on. So that's a personal thing, but because of that transition, EMU and Creative's fortunes as well, the sound blaster market went away from them as well. So their board pressured the CEO, who was very supportive of EMU, to cut back on things. And about 2011, they finally pulled the plug on the last bit of EMU. And I left Creative at that point and took 4 years off from designing synthesizers to design chips for cell phones, which was a lot of fun, managing a big department of these $1 million chips and so on and so forth, latest processes. But towards the end of that period, I found myself literally in tears at a couple times in music kind of movie theater, watching a movie about the creation of music, and realized how much I missed being involved in it. So when Marco Alpert, who was VP of marketing for many years at EMU and then became VP of marketing for Antares, the people who make Autotune, when he left Antares, he came to me and he said, Dave, we've got a few years left. How do you feel about starting a music company? And I said, well, I'd like to do that, but I'd really like somebody else to throw some money into it, just not just out of my pocket. And so then this guy showed up, Bill Putnam. Bill Putnam is CEO of Universal Audio, which is also located over in Santa Cruz, Scotts Valley technically, but it's Santa Cruz. And Bill said, this sounds like a real opportunity for Universal Audio. If we can get some of your time, Dave, to help out UA in analog world, we'll invest in Rossum Electro and let you operate out of our facility. So the Rossum Electro, we actually are in the premises of Universal Audio. The companies are good friends and bounce ideas back and forth. And we were joined a little later by Bob Bliss. Bob Bliss was one of the last guys at the research center that had been set up at Creative as part of what was left of EMU. And he is a fabulous programmer. And that was the birth of Rossum Electro. Here's the three of us at NAMM. 2017, let me just check we're doing fine on time. So, when we started Rossum Electro, we had ideas for really 4 different product areas. I wanted to do something that was all analog. I love designing analog, and even though digital is so powerful that it's always very exciting what it can do, there's just something very special about analog. So I wanted to do an all analog product. I wanted to do a sampler. There was no really credible sampler of what I wanted to do in the Eurorack at that time. So we targeted doing a sampler. And then the other thing was there was a synthesizer called Morpheus from EMU. It was a sleeper. It came out at the exact same week as the Yamaha VL, which was Yamaha's first digital modeling instrument. And Yamaha flew virtually everybody from the United States music press over to Tokyo and paid their expenses for a week for this announcement of this great thing right when Morpheus came out. So nobody noticed that Morpheus came out, and it became totally a cult instrument. There were a handful of people who thought this is the best synthesizer that's ever been made, and were just nuts over it, and nobody else knew about it at all. And it was hard to get into. It had a little tiny display, and this room was full of guts behind, in terms of what you could do behind the little tiny display, so you had to put up with that. At any rate, Morpheus we split into actually 2 modules, one of which was the filter itself, which is really fascinating in sound and is wonderfully adapted to Eurorack. I knew that right as soon as the thought came into our head. And then there was something that had the ignominious name of function generator inside Morpheus, and that became our control forge product, or our control voltage source. So let's talk a little bit of the slide talk about it, because I've got the slides here. This circuit right here is that same circuit I had circled at the very beginning of the talk, a new way of getting the signal out of the Moog ladder. And then I came up with another idea, which was to be able to vary the poles in a ladder, which nobody had ever done before. And when I prototyped that one Saturday, it sounded so cool, I knew this was it. Called up Marco, he came down to the lab and said, yep, that's it. So we now had our first all analog product, the Evolution. I have an audio demo of it here, but I won't play it because we'll hear it, honest to God, over there. And it did win an Electronic Musician Product of the Year award. Then from Morpheus, we got the Morpheus module. Again, we'll get to play a lot with that there, so even though I have Perfect Circuit's wonderful video over here, I don't think I'll play that. Then Control Forge and Satellite. These are, they're a little harder to demo, particularly for somebody who's not a musician, because you really have to hear what it can do in musical pieces. But I can give you a pretty good tour of what's behind it and so on, and maybe what your appetite for what it can do. Again, I'll skip the demo on that. And then a simulator, our sampler, and it's a phase modulation sampler. This was, again, a total delight to me when I thought of doing a sampler. Okay, I want to do something new. It isn't just going to be the same old stuff. And just adapting a sampler to Eurorack, we'll talk more about that when I give the demo, was really a fun project because it had never been done before, and it's really different than the standard samplers in what you can do with it and so on. But this idea of phase modulation, of being able to use one waveform to control where you are in the playback of another waveform. It's sort of like you're doing a record scratch controlled by a sound is really how you can think of it. I went to research it to see if that had been done, and I couldn't find anything on the web that indicated even academic people had done it. So I did some models and discovered that if you take a trumpet sample and modulate it with a piano sample through some very curious arithmetic, you end up with so that was just too good to be true. We knew what we were doing after that. So those are the Rossum Electro-Modules. They're all out. They're all more or less available. The simulator keeps selling out because people want too many of them, but that's a good problem for us to have. And we build them as fast as we can. Okay, let's start with evolution because it's the simplest one to understand. The evolution, it's a low-pass filter. We've all heard low-pass filters. The reason you buy an evolution is because you're a connoisseur of sound. I've been told by, matter of fact, at Superbooth, I had done this little write-up and shared it with my colleague who was an Austrian over there. I said, at the end of the thing, I said, evolution has been called the best sounding analog filter ever. I hope you'll agree. And he sort of made fun of me. That sounds too much like Mark. So about halfway through the first day, a guy comes up to me and he says, I got the evolution. That's the best sounding analog filter ever. So I dragged him over to and this happened about 4 or 5 times during the thing. I had great fun just agonizing on us with that. At any rate, it is a good sounding filter. You really have to appreciate it. You should listen to it in a studio. So I'll just give you a quick run of the features here. What I've got now is the assembler, and I'm just going to use it as a sawtooth waveform generator here. So if we're lucky, we can get a little more volume on that right now.
That's this one.
That's right. So. Now it's well designed. It will filter things from down way sub-audio or you actually can get the thing to oscillate one cycle every 20 seconds or something like that, all the way up to 40 kHz. And it stays in tune better than many Eurorack oscillators if you put it in oscillation and put it in the 1 volt per octave. So, its claim to fame is the wonderfulness of that sound. We have nice features in it. Of course, you've got voltage-controlled Q. And we have a knob on it called Q compensation. The classic Moog filter, which I've got it set to now, if you listen to what happens as I turn that Q way up. The bottom kind of drops out of the sound as you get up. And that's a pretty known effect of this kind of filter. And there's just an analog way to handle that, so instead the volume stays there. That we call that Q compensation. If I turn it all the way, now the bottom will stay flat. And if I do the same thing here again, you can hear there the bass is staying with the thing. And like with all filters of the side, this might get a little loud. It gives you a beautifully pure sine wave oscillator, no harmonics in there at all. But sometimes that's useful in your music, and of course then you can audio rate modulate it and so on, and get really nice sounds out of that. And I feel that's just for the fun of that. So it is exponential modulation. Let's throw it into here and put the thing in oscillation. Modulate it with a sawtooth rather than exciting it. So we actually had a different name for evolution as we developed it, but somebody stole the name from us. Literally, another product came out the day before we were going to announce the name of evolution, and so we had to switch names, and that was when the name evolution came up. And we decided, that's, Marco came up with the name. I said, that sounds good, but let's have some fun with it. So we changed the names of the other controls, which had more just, classically descriptive things, into genus and species to keep with the evolution theme. So genus, as I mentioned before, I found a way that you could, when I had the basic filter, Marco said, well, can we voltage control the slope? And I explained, a technical engineer's description that the ladder filter comes in discrete steps of the ladder. You can't have a ladder with 1.5 steps. So you have to either have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 poles. So I said, no, we can't do that, but as my friend and partner Scott used to say, well, when Dave says it's impossible, about 2 weeks after we'll figure out how to do it. And then that same thing happened. I thought, there must be something we can do with that. And I realized that there would be a way to continuously skip steps of the ladder. So you make sort of that extra step kind of appear out of nowhere and then become the only one you can see. But it's a nice continuous analog thing. It isn't switching, which wouldn't sound good at all. So that's what we do with the genus control. If you just put like a pulse waveform this time in here, there's 3 poles, and you'll be able to hear the fundamental. And you can hear it as I kind of jump in between. It's continuous, but it has got steps in it. So that, depending on what waveforms you're putting in, that in itself can be interesting. But the way a ladder filter works, it gets its resonance from feeding around the ladder. So how much delay you've got, and hence what frequency it's going to oscillate, depends on the number of poles. So that gives this very nice change that's quite musical in the resonance. So let's throw that pulse in there again. We'll start with 3 poles. So you can hear that frequency, that resonance dancing around in there, again in a nice continuous way. So if we grab something like an LFO and modulate that, there we go. So hear those resonances dancing around. And you also can do fun things like nice little random dancing around and so on. So it ends up being another wonderful way of creating the harmonic content and accents that you want. The final control, the species control, technically it's really what other people have called a drive control. It's a couple of VCAs around the filter. So you're either overdriving the filter or just you're making it as clean as it possibly can. And it works very well in the evolution. Let's see if we can, it's one of these things, again, that's a relatively subtle sound, but with the extremes of the sound, you can hear it pretty well. So let's turn up a little bit of resonance and fire back our sawtooth over there. So there the filter's being very lightly driven, so it's very linear, it's very clean. If I start turning up the species control, we can now begin to hear some fairly substantial distortion in this harmonics. When you get way up here, so you can hear some nice modulations happening in there. So the combination of all 4 control voltages gives you a lot of handles on the sound. It's nothing that smacks you in the face, but it's got a lot of subtlety to it. So if you're into a real analog sound, that's what it's about. I hope in the future to be able to design some more analog modules because they're really fun to do. But the flip side is there's so much you can do with digital. So pretty much the rest of the Rossum modules, while they're all interfaced to be analog in the Eurorack world, internal, their guts are digital. Sometimes if you want to ask me about analog versus digital, I'll give you my opinions on that. But we won't do that in the talk right now. You'll have to ask me later. Let's now step over to Control Forge. But Control Forge is based on a real simple set of concepts. What it's called, of course, is the universal CV generator. And back when we were designing Morpheus, Neil Warren, a colleague of mine at EMU, realized that if you wanted to think about envelopes and LFOs and things like that, you could simplify it into really 4 basic things. The first thing is, what voltage are we talking about? We can divide any envelope or LFO up into sections or segments, we call it. And so you can take a segment of it and you can say, okay, where is it going in terms of voltage? And then we can ask, how long does it take to get there? Those are the two obvious ones. The third one, what shape does it take as it gets there? And the fourth one, what does it do once it gets there? And with these four basic parameters, stringing them together, you can make pretty arbitrary shapes. Control Forge has 8 different segments down the bottom in what we call a preset. So a preset has 8 segments into them. Now you can put fewer if you just make it jump to the end, because that's one of the things you can do when you get to the end of a segment. But you can have up to 8. And then very cleverly we allow you to string them together so you can get more than 8. So you really aren't limited, but they come in lumps of 8. Control Forge has 2 different modes of operation. We call them play and program mode. So let's start by a quick tour of program mode. We see in the display up here that you've got time, and there we can pick a time for a given segment. I'm programming segment 1 down here right now, which is the S1 that's showing up there. And again, a huge range from 6 thousandths of a second on up to 10,000 seconds. That should be plenty long enough for most people's music. Then we're going to go to a voltage. That voltage, anywhere from -5 to +5 volts. We chose that as the range. You got a 10-volt sweep. Now you also can, in addition to that, you can make that voltage be absolute. It's going to that no matter what happens. Or we can make it relative to the previous place. So I can go 1 volt more than wherever it was that I started the segment. We can quantize it, by stepping through different quantization, absolute and absolute quantize, so we can quantize it to semitones there. And we can also add some amount of randomness to that to make interesting. And that randomness can be from 0 to the entire amount, and you can make the randomness be, I think there's a global function in here where you can change the distribution of the randomness as well. So you've really got a lot of control over there, control over that destination voltage. Then, most fun of all are the different shapes you can get, and let's take a look at those. You can get there in a straight line, that's pretty obvious. You can get there in exponential curves, like your typical envelope generator like that. You can get things more like a circle. You can begin to put kinks in things at various points, or maybe more than one kink. The kinks can go in different directions. We can get concave circular things. A couple of useful ones, delay DC and DC delay lets you do step sequencers. You can jump immediately to where you want to go, or you can wait till the very end where you were and then suddenly jump to a new place right at the end. Then we start getting these more wild ones like zigzag, where you get there but you sort of jitter back and forth before you arrive, or vice versa. And then we've got real randomness stuff. We have chaotic things and then literally random things. And if that isn't enough for you, well, we also have the ability, we have control voltage input, so you can just take a control voltage, and for that segment it'll follow the control voltage. Okay, so you can see the stuff just gets really wild. It's very deep. You've got to be that kind of person to like this module. I mean, if you just like a few knobs and twist them, Control Forge probably isn't for you. But there are a lot of people who just get into this stuff, and that's great. We love them all. They're all musicians. We're all a family. Then you got the jump target. What are you going to do when you get to the end of this segment? Here I've got it jumping to segment 1, but you can jump to stopped, to stuff with a sequencer. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you can jump to any other preset. That's how you can chain them along. So, and then the jump mode, you can decide, gee, I'm never going to jump in the segment, or I'm always going to jump in the segment at its end. Or then I can do it on various conditions. If the gate to the module is rising, I'll do it immediately, or on the gate fall. or if the gate's high at the end. Again, you know, these fabulous lists. The things that people have been able to develop with this are just crazy. You can find them out on the web and so on. It's got, I guess the real shortcoming of it is it's a fair amount of module space for a single control voltage output, but boy does that control voltage output do a lot of stuff. It's got a couple of triggers as well, and those are programmable so that you can assign, that's on the assign triggers button. You can assign a trigger to begin on the beginning of any segment or the end or certain segments, things like that. So you can now trigger other things in the segments and so on. So the bottom line is you can build up a lot of different presets, just some of the ones that we have coming standard. Here's something called a conditional LFO. So you can see, let me get into play mode here. So going into play mode now, once we programmed that, in the play mode, I now fire something off and away this thing goes into what we call a conditional LFO. We can see on the line up at the top that it's just bouncing up and down. That's the output voltage. And the little segment there is telling us how we're stepping through the various segments, which are in this case just various circular curves on the thing. You have a lot of things you can do in real time on the panel as well. We can quantize just by pressing the button. We aren't listening to it, so you can't really hear what's doing that. You can randomize things. Again, we can go pretty nuts with the thing. And then you've got controls. You've got a time scale control voltage and time control on the knob over here. The other thing you'll notice right now on the display, everything's in seconds. There's a different mode we can choose, which puts instead you can now give it a tempo, a number of beats per minute, and now it'll speak in note notation and things like that, which is very useful if your music is oriented towards that kind of stuff. And finally, as I mentioned, there's this idea of a preset sequencer that you can externally from another sequencer or from another control forge, if you want to do it, use these trigger pulses to step between presets as you're running. So you have control of a meta level of the presets as well. That's also quite useful in performances. You can just fire off a button and reconfigure all your envelope generators. I've done demos, some of my canned demos for the shows. I use that to just, and now let's go to this demo on that one. I didn't set one of these here because I figured it's more fun to just talk about projects. Anyway, that's control forge and satellite, which I've got going over here. A satellite is a control forge without all the programming interface. It costs a little more than half as much, and if you've got a control forge, you just put a patch cord between them, press a couple of buttons, you can dump everything this one knows into that one, and now you've got a duplicate of that. So that's why this particular system has 3 satellites and control forge, is you now got nice 4 control voltage generators, which gives you quite a bit of flexibility on that. So that said, let's switch over to Morpheus. Morpheus is a lot more fun to demo, and I think I can get some pretty good sounds out of it over here. The idea behind Morpheus is it's something, the marketing name at EMU is a Z-plane filter, but it's a complex filter. And so here's kind of a puzzle for you. If you've got a really complex filter, filters, as we know, we talked about evolution being a 4-pole filter. Morpheus is what's called a 14th order filter, which means it has 7 what we call complex poles and 7 complex zeros, which then in turn means you can have 7 resonances and 7 notches in the frequency spectrum and get anything in between. So you can just get these wild frequency responses. If we can get the camera to look at it there, I'm going to slide it up as close as we can. There we go. You can see it actually displays the frequency response of the filter in real time. So let me do a quick patch change here. And we can, let's just turn some knobs without listening to anything. You can see how wild that frequency response can be with all of these notches and resonance and so on. They just get weird shapes out of there. Well, let's listen to that and see what it sounds like. So let's fire off some noise over here. Yep. What do I have to do? I have to turn on the loop on that guy. So you can see all the interesting sounds that you can get out of the complex filter. How do you control a filter like that? If you did it in the obvious way, we've got 7 frequencies of these resonances and 7 amplitudes of the resonances and 7 frequencies of the notches and 7 amplitudes. That adds up to 28 control voltages. That's going to take a lot of panel space and a lot of control forces to control all of that. So back at EMU, we came up with a solution, and the idea is what we call a cube model. That you take these complex frequency responses and you have a sound designer pick 8 of them that work well together, and conceptually put those at the 8 corners of a cube in audio space. And then we use 3 control voltages to move in 3 different directions. And now we can navigate ourselves through that cube, and the magic of Morpheus, this is what's special about it, is as we move through, it's sonically continuous. It sounds like it's supposed to sound like, which you could sort of tell as I was playing with the knobs over here. So that's all well and good. What do they sound like? And the story is that these cubes are not something that are easy to design. It really takes a sound designer to put together. And some of the technology, the original Morpheus module actually was not guaranteed to be unconditionally stable. And so if you owned a Morpheus, about once a month we'd steal a note from you, because you'd hit something that was unstable, and we had a little processor in there that would just watch for that and take that note away. Nobody ever noticed it. Once a month, you can steal that many notes and nobody notices. I don't know where they went. They may have gone in somebody's bank account. Anyway, but we were able to design this so it's unconditionally stable, but it still is not easy to design these cubes so that they sound good. So we instead shamelessly ripped off the Morpheus cubes, actually the Ultra Proteus cubes, from EMU. I still have a good relationship with creators, so they don't really mind when I do this sort of thing. And adapted them to the slight changes in the Morpheus filter. So we have a palette of 288 different cubes that are available in Morpheus. So this flanger that I chose just to play with noise is an example. Now, of course, we can do just traditional synthesizer filters. You've got plenty of power to do that. So if I go back and play my friendly sawtooth waveform over here. There, I've got a Q control on that one. And some nice frequency controls on the other. So you can imitate all kinds of other filters in there. And get a high pass over here. Very high pass. We can get, one of the things that it does absolutely fabulously is vocal sounding filters, because our voice, the way it works, is it has a number of different resonances in them. So here, if I put I really should lower the frequency of that. So let's get some control voltages into this thing. So let me just grab various LFOs moving around here and play with this thing. Again, you get a lot of vocal sounds out of the Morpheus. Now, this filter here has a .4 at the end of it. And what the .4 means is the sound designer didn't want to use all 8 corners of the cube. He used only 4 corners. So in this case, let's just excite it with something. We can see in the frequency response here, these are several different peaks moving around in Now, what you heard just there is Morpheus beginning to distort. And that's because when we have a .4 filter, we've got a floating control voltage over there, because it's now only 2 dimensions. And we use that as voltage-controlled distortion. You can do it on any of the cubes, but you're going to lose a dimension if you go on the 8 dimension. Morpheus, the original Morpheus synthesizer, had a really unusual distortion characteristic. We carried that over into here, where it sort of grabs onto things and holds onto them. It isn't your typical digital distortion. So if I fire this guy off and this. So you can get some, it's very reminiscent of feedback guitars and things like that. So there's a lot of space out there. And I know everybody wants to hear about a simulator, and we're getting a little close to the time when we have to move on. So let's jump over and give you the tour of a simulator. So that's a quick thing with Morpheus. We played with, what, 5 filters here, and there's 288 of them, so plenty to play with there. Morpheus, by the way, is our best-selling module at this point, and continues to do well. So a simulator, as I said, it's a sampler. It's very easy to sample. I don't have a feedback from my output, but frequently when I begin a demo, I'll have my mic plugged in and show you how easy it is to sample the sound into it. Basically, you just go into sampling setup and make sure that the sample is armed, and then press a button, and you're now recording sound. Press another button, and you're done with it. And you can immediately play that sound back. It's now in a channel, ready to go. So you can design so that you can be sampling during your performances. The other thing about the sampling in a simulator is that it doesn't stop anything else. So you can sample all 8 channels playing at once and sample. There's no limitations on that. A simulator saves its sounds on a little SD card. Can you see that there? Yeah, that's in focus. We give you one with the product, but you can import sounds if you don't want to sample them yourself as a WAV file. So you just put WAV files into folders, and the simulator will see them and play them. Pretty flexible that way, and so on. A simulator thinks in terms of folders. So I've got a folder here that was from the NAMM demo, and when I press that button, let me do it again because there's a couple of things going on there. When I press the button, you'll see a progress bar that spins across the top. A little thing that happens for just a second in the center of the screen. What's going on there? Again, a simulator is really designed to be able to use in real time. So when you go to load a folder, it first immediately loads whatever sounds are in the first preset. of that folder. Preset is a collection of sounds that you can play at a given instant. And then after it's got that all done, it then begins to load any sounds, because it takes a while to load sounds, they're big long files, into memory. But once you've loaded that first preset, you can start playing immediately. So that's one of the features that we put, many features we put in to allow you to do things in real time. When you've got a preset, you just turn the knob and click to pick different demos here. What I'm going to do starting out is go back and grab some of our basic demos up here. Okay, a simulator is an 8-channel sampler, which means it can play 8 sounds at once. Those could be the same sound, you could load it into all 8 channels and you can play something polyphonically, or they can be completely different sounds. In this case right here, what I've got, let's see what we... that was a bad choice.
Wrong.
The thing I've got going on. Let's turn this guy into the null filter.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
8 different channels, and you saw the lights going there. When we go to set up a channel, there's lots of interesting things we can talk just about the channel that's playing. So I'm going to bring up the channel screen here. The first thing you'll see up here is what sample is, and the sample names are whatever your file names are. In this case, we've just named them after the numbers that's being spoken.
1,
for example. Then you'll see something else over here called the mode, right here. You see one is master and the others are in a mode called cycle. If we go over here and ask what modes are available, master, link, stereo, and cycle. So the master mode means when you trigger this thing, it plays. When you have somebody that's in cycle mode, it says, if there's a master above me, I'm going to swap with that master. So you can, this is for when you want to play multiple notes and have them overlap, for example. Link means I'm going to play in tandem with my master up there. And stereo means this is a stereo sample, which is going to take 2 samples to play. So I'm going to behave as though I'm the right side of the sample and my master is the left-hand side of the sample. We want this guy to be on master up here. In addition to that, we have this X column over here. If I go over here and load a demo called crossfade, that's what that's all about. So let's go over here, and here you'll see now that these various samples have setups for their crossfade in here. And you have different crossfade groups, so you can, and what a crossfade does, let me get out of the channels and just play, first of all, just one of the samples down here. And what I've done, another feature of a simulator, sorry for kind of dancing around, but you need this piece of information. We've got 24 control voltages coming into a simulator. We can steal one of those control voltages and assign it to the knob here. It's very useful for demoing and also for real-time purpose. In this case, and that's indicated down here, crossfade, we're using 1A to control things. So control voltage channel 1A is now assigned to this knob. And if I just play one of the channels down here and turn this knob, you'll see it begins to play in a certain range of the knob. That's how crossfade works. If I take a different channel up here, it plays over a different range of the knob. And what I've got the thing set up to do in the channel mode here, I've got the channel 1 being the master and all the others being linked. Then they're going to go into this crossfade group and each have their own little section of crossfade that they use. So I can... Oh, I know it. Now that's virtually the whole idea of doing the simulator was to get everything off of control voltage. So you can modulate that with the control voltage. Also, every control voltage on the simulator is being sampled at the audio sample rate. So they can be audio rate, all of that works just great. So that's the meaning of the little X up on the channels page. Now, so you can play 8 channels, each one can have a sound in them, that's great. But what if you've got a channel that you'd really like to have some variation in the sound in? That's what zones are about. So in addition to zones, if we load up, let's grab the zones demo over here. Here I've got a single channel with number 1, our friendly sample 1 up in there. But if I go into the zones for channel 1, you can see that the top zone is number 1 and going down is going down to 8. So if I go back and again get into a play mode here,
4,
now I can change which zone I'm playing with a control voltage.
1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6, 4, 7, 8, 5, 4, 3.
Now if I'm right, okay, you'll see this demo is called gated, and the reason it's called gated
2, 2, 3, 4.
is because it's choosing a zone of when the gate comes in, right at the beginning of the note. Very obvious use is I'm going to take a velocity control voltage, apply it to the CV, and then choose a different sample that I've done at different velocities, or use that same control voltage to sample a particular drum sound out of a drum kit. But you also can get into the continuous mode, and now
4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 7, 7, 5, 5, 3, 3, 2, 2, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7.
we've got a really fun demo of that. And now we're switching live. This was put together by Wreak Havoc, I think. And this has again under voltage control. So if you line up your sounds nicely, this continuous switching back and forth can really do some nice things. And if you don't line them well, it can do some really bizarre things. Okay, we've scratched out of placing samples and zones and channels and so on. But we've got like about 20 different other parameters that you can modulate with the sampler. The obvious thing to modulate, let's again pull up a let's go to the NAM demo and bring in one of these natural instruments. You can obviously modulate the pitch. Hold on. This sampler is very unusual. Most will go up and down an octave or so. This will go up 5 octaves and down about 15 or 16. It just, again, we went totally nuts with this. And it does it without aliasing the sounds. It's really very, very pure, unless you want to, because one of the parameters we've got over in the mutate column is how much aliasing you've got. And that's, again, voltage controllable. So we can take our, it's actually, if I set the, let me set the pitch up to, I won't do that right here. There's probably a demo of voltage control aliasing anyway. But so we've got control of pitch. We've got control of linear FM, so we can do that nice, and it is a through zero linear FM. We've got exponential FM for modulation there. The pitches of the sounds are controlled within the zone, so you don't have to match your zones up, your sounds up for pitch in the zones. You can adjust the zone, pitch, and level independently as well. In addition to the pitch control, you of course have level control. You can decide how loud a sound is. You can amplitude modulate it linearly or exponentially. The sound has an envelope associated with it, so that when we fire off a sound, let me get our trumpet back again. I've got the thing right now enveloped so that it has a very fast attack and a relatively fast release. We can make the release quite a bit longer. And we can of course make the attack longer. Again, these parameters are all voltage controllable, so you can voltage controlling your attack and release there. Now, in the trumpet sound, we now move on to the other things you can do with the samples, or you can loop them. So the trumpet you can hear has a loop in it. I've made the trumpet loop so that it keeps looping. This little sort of trumpet-based logo on there is showing that it keeps looping as you release it. You also can make it so that, let me get the release time long. So when I release it, it runs through the end of the sound rather than looping forever. We can either make the sound one shot, where it doesn't end at the end of the gate, that we played all the way through the sound, or gated. Let's turn our release time back down again. So we have control over how the envelope works over there. The other fun thing we have control over when we've got a loop sound like this is the loop parameters. Here we can see a nice display of the lines for the loop. A little hard to read up in there, but we can misalign the loop here. Let's go to the loop start here and you can modulate, again, voltage control, the loop start, the loop end, the loop length, various things like that. That allows you to do some very wild stuff as well, which we'll see just in a second. It's a stereo output. We have 8 individual channel outputs. You've got left and right output. You can voltage control the pan in there. You can individually control the mix as well. So if you don't want an output to come out the mix at all, you can adjust that level. And then in the mutate menu, we've got the aliasing control I mentioned before. We've got a bit crusher, which is continuous, so you can voltage control and determine your number of bits in there. We have got a thing that allows you to reverse the sample as well. That isn't voltage controlled. And we've got, there's a feature also you'll see over here that just happens to fit on the mutate page called smooth. When you do have a crappy loop, you can either choose not to smooth that, in which case it will give you a nice sharp edge, or it will splice the thing up together so that you don't get the first order discontinuity, you don't get the snap at different edges. That also applies when you switch from one zone to another. It doesn't, switch immediately between samples with a really ugly snap. Let's finally go over into my favorite phase mod. I think I have a phase mod demo here. So here I've got 4 different sets of samples. When phase modulation, you're taking one sound and modulating another. You can phase modulate with a different channel of the sampler, or you can phase modulate from external patches that you put in. External audio can also service that. Or you can use the control voltages. They're not quite as high fidelity as the audio input. So you've got lots of things you can phase modulate with. And you also can chain up the phase modulation. You can do what Yamaha used to call multiple operator phase modulation. One guy phase modulates another phase modulation. And you can phase modulate the thing itself. So lots of flexibility, but the sound that it gives is really a lot of fun. Here's the one that I gave in the demo over there where we've got no sound. Oh, I know, because I have to go over here because I don't let the piano come out the... So there's the piano, which I don't have in the mix, but if I play the trumpet with the piano in there, now so you can go from the wild to the really nice and organic sounding thing. The next one I've got is a violin sample. I'll have to, and that's modulating a bassoon. So. Fun stuff. What have I got here? This is a sawtooth being modulated by. And this one's, the bottom one's really fun. I just did this as a vibe. It's a stereo violin, or each half of the stereo is modulating the other one. So that's in a really low frequency. That little raspy thing is kind of characteristic of when something's phase modulating itself. So that's when they're going back and forth and getting in a fight with each other. So,
are you loading everything into RAM when it sees a card? You're just loading by contents of one folder at a time?
One folder at a time. So just overall in terms of memory, the thing has a half a gigabyte of total memory. We do steal a little bit of that because we're using 32 bits everywhere, so we're saving the samples in 32 bits. So even if you got an 8-bit sample, that doesn't do you any good in how much sound you can store in the thing. But that's about 2,400 seconds of mono 48 kHz sounds.
How many samples per folder?
That is basically unlimited. At a point it gets difficult to manage, and we're doing some things to make it a little easier to manage. Right now it's a little harder than it should be. So we have got the ability to upgrade software, and we're already on 1.02, and 1.03 is probably going to be coming up pretty soon. And we'll have a few minor bug fixes. We found a couple of bugs, and some of the major feature enhancements that everybody requested. So, again, wild and crazy things you can do with it. I think there's still a lot of people discovering new things that we never thought of, and that's, again, as an instrument designer, that's what I love, is when the musicians come up and take an instrument that I've designed and then come up with something I never thought anybody would do with and make great music with it. So, anyway, that's what I've got. Come on up afterwards, individual questions or whatever you want, and thanks for being here tonight.